Welcome to Brain Pickings, the podcast where we challenge the status quo in HR and explore what's next for people, work, and organizations. I'm Leslie, founder of ZigZagHR, and I'm here to help you rethink, reboot, and retool the way you lead HR. You're listening to a special series diving into the 2025 Global Human Capital Trends Report by Deloitte. Today, we're addressing a paradox many of us feel. What if the way we work is actually getting in the way of real work? Meetings, emails, reports, outdated processes with optimized activity but not necessarily outcomes. Well, in this episode, we dive into how organizations can reclaim focus, how they can free up capacity and redesign work so people can actually do what matters. Because it's time to stop being busy and start being effective. And my guest for this episode is Yves Van Durme, Global Human Capital Leader and co-author of the Global Human Capital Trends Report. Hi, Yves.
Hello.
Everything okay with you
Absolutely.
today? Okay, well, I'm very happy to be here. And maybe first of all, tell us a bit more about Human Capital Trends Report. Give us some main insights.
So Human Capital Trends, this edition is the 15th edition. Mm-hmm. I think it's by now probably the longest, so longitudinal study. We have 13,000 respondents, so it gives us sort of the breadth and depth over many years of human capital trends research. And I keep on looking at the trends that are related to people, organization, HR, culture, learning, to put into perspective and see how they evolve. And I think we are capturing at least two trends which have been spoken about in different ways over the years. And I think there's some very interesting highlights. And we also look at it from a country-specific lens in terms of respondents by country, but also being able to look into it from an industry or sector perspective to sort of see some better benchmarking in terms of what do others do in our industry or in our geographies, which adds an additional, I think, depth to the research as well.
Yeah, for sure. Now, in our quest to be productive, we've created systems, tools, processes, but they're actually blocking real productivity. The business is real, but it isn't really meaningful. So what are, according to you, Yves, the biggest culprits of lost capacity in today's organizations, and how did we get there?
I think we got there for a couple of reasons. I think there is the way we've been organizing work has typically started from we define processes. We look at potential underlying technology, and then we look at what humans should be doing. I think that has been, in a dominant way, the way we've been organizing. So, in other words, humans have been a bit of an afterthought in how we've been organizing work, because it's very much been sort of engineered. Yeah. And engineers have a certain way to look at, and the human factor has also been engineered in that sort of logic. I think that's certainly one. The second is also looking at the mindset, and the mindset of what is productive and what is perceived to be productive and what you need to do. And there is also a logic of the mindset in terms of when are you successful? You mentioned busyness. Busyness has for a long time for managers been you need to be branded as very busy because you're probably very effective and so there's a combination of factors that have gotten us there. And I think technology evolution is also making it even faster. We're hoping for better solution, but we see more explicit challenges with technology, and the coolest technology, AI, Gen AI, of course, comes to mind as well.
Okay. Why do so many organizations measure productivity based on visible effort rather than meaningful outcomes?
The most obvious one is the belief that managers have you need to see what people do. So that's also, productivity is fairly easy to measure because hours are fairly objective. This is also depending on the sort of relations you have, the sort of trust in your environment, but also partnership, and so the relationship with social partners also plays a role. So productivity is fairly easy to mention. It's not very much a human factor. I tend to tease human resource colleagues quite a lot in terms of, I would suspect most of us have gotten into that type of activity for the sake of the human more than the sake of the resource. But we measure resources, and productivity is easier to measure. It is a critical measure because as an economist, you need to look at it, like what's the return on employment, the return on cost of employment, and so on. So it is a critical, fundamental measure, but not enough if we want to address some of the human element. And I think the last one, as it is easy to measure, we still have a lot of elements like we use what's easy to measure.
Yeah. True. Now, optimizing work, it isn't enough. It's time to rethink Slack. What is the concept of Slack and why is it so crucial for performance, creativity, resilience?
I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. Slack has a negative connotation. Slack is what some generation will look at. The next generations, they're a bit, quote unquote, taking it easy. Slack is not about that. Slack is one way of looking at it is we've been sprinting. So agile methodology has taught us sprinting. There's a lot of benefits in sprinting. But I think we've felt that humans are not the greatest sort of sequential, serial sprinters. We need to have a break once in a while. We need to eat, we need to sleep and stuff like that. And at a sort of bigger level, we need to reinvent ourselves once in a while. But organizations have taken the hang of, let's sprint, let's go faster and more sprints and shorter sprints and we can do more. So I think that's certainly one. But Slack is also, our body works better when we can shut down. We need to shut down. Some of our most creative ideas do not come when we think about, let's be creative about the solution, but they sometimes come from having our brain do something else. And then and often our best ideas come.
In my case, while I'm ironing. Can you believe it?
Imagine we would design work with ironing as part of the work package.
Could be an idea.
If it's, that would be very individual. But I think if we use that same analogy, is how do we get into situations where we find Slack, we find that space. Slack is also what you have if you are climbing, if you are mountain climbing, you want a bit of slack on the rope in case of. So you could look at it from a risk perspective. You want a bit of slack because these days there's a lot of uncertainty. So why would you plan 100% of your capacity and then be surprised that you have no flexibility? That is an organizational reason, but an individual reason is if you want me to be able to respond, to be creative, I need maybe not ironing in my case, but how do you find sort of these moments that help us to sort of recenter, to get energy back, to think about other things, and at the same time that leads to sometimes our most creative ideas, it supports our well-being, our resilience. How do we find it? How do we keep that slack and make it something positive, not a negative connotation?
Not a negative connotation, indeed. How can leaders shift from an always busy mindset to one that is focused on value creation then?
It is a difficult one because value creation is, none of the leaders would say, I'm consciously not focusing on value creation. So we need to find sort of a good way to look at, let's be ruthless about what supports value creation. Our report suggests that up to 41% of the time people spend is not considered adding value to their organization. So 41, if you would work 5 days in a week, that basically means that a bit more than 2 days of your week are not contributing value. I'm not saying it's all irrelevant, but not contributing value. So I think we need to be clear on what is value and how to contribute. And then we should probably start unpacking it because one of the things is collaboration, is we've been promoting collaboration left, right, and center. And I think we now have a collaboration overload. Like for any decision in any sizable organization, so many people get involved. It's nice to be involved and there's all good reasons to be involved, but do we really need that? And sort of how do we sort of get back to what is potentially healthier balance on collaboration? You mentioned meeting overload, which is also support, but also technologies. We had since I think the early 1900s, we had the promise that the new technologies will make us work less.
15 hours a week.
Yeah, that was the amazing prediction. By the end of the century, we are beyond the end of the century. I think you have predictions of the 4-hour work week. So I think technology has great potential, but we seem to be using it to have people use their hours more effectively, more. I think Slack is still something like, if you're not busy, are you being productive? And we need to try to get out of that perspective. And that's where the value is not looking busy. It's important to be well connected. It's important to have a network. But a network is not necessarily by being seen by all the people at the right moments. It's also about what do we actually do with it? How do we use these connections? And that's where it's amazing how GenAI can help us to further foster knowledge creation, collaboration. It's also at risk of making it again more because technology promises have not always been meeting their expectation. How do we build on that to stimulate? And that's where every manager can have a role because we, as a manager, whatever seniority you have an impact on how you use the time of your team, how you focus on certain priorities. That's also where we see a challenge. We see when we ask workers, how comfortable do they feel to express that they're working on something which is not adding value? That is fairly low. So there seems to be a sentiment where it's difficult for workers to say, I'm working on something which I'm not sure is contributing value. So I think we also need to foster a different dialogue if that's not already the case in your organization. We should feel comfortable about what's the role of ironing in your creativity, or whatever it is for every colleague that you work with.
Okay, so there's a role for the leaders. There's also a role for HR teams that they can support a work reset, evaluating what tasks truly contribute to business and to human outcomes. No.
Absolutely, and I think that's where HR has a double role, because HR is typically the function that is so keen to help others, which is great because we are an enabling function, but I think we also need to help ourselves. If you're looking at recruitment is under pressure in many environments because it's difficult to find specific forms of talent, and just think about IT has been booming, and data science, and we all fighting, quote unquote, for more and less talent. How do we find them? But at the same time, parts of our processes are still not very efficient. We are doing a couple of things again and again. So how can we use AI to sort of facilitate the process? How can we limit? You could look at the same thing in learning, and there's so much powerful tools that you can use to sort of advance the design of new content creation, if that's a choice beyond curation. That's for the HR function itself. I think what we also need to look at is how HR helps the rest of the organization, because if some of the work we do is not adding value, and it might be perception, but I think that perception at least worthwhile to look into. How can we redesign maybe team structures, broader organizational structures, and HR has a role to play. Let's find that. Let's also make sure we have the people data, because it would be so much more insightful than rather having general averages, which our reports suggest. What does that mean for your organization? Yeah. How much of the work that people do in your organization is not adding value? And then we should rethink, because that's where technology would be brilliant. How can we minimize that? And we spend, apparently, most of us spend at least 200 hours a year on switching between different applications, softwares, and tools. That's a very heavy cost of switching cost. Some people call that a tax of toggling between one and the other. That's something we should what is that tax, and how can we take it away? Because in Belgium, at least, we don't like to pay taxes, apparently. So how can we use that to our benefit in getting away that tax of switching between different devices, different types of tools?
So technology, and especially AI, can either worsen the problem or it can become part of the solution.
Absolutely, and I think we captured it last year when we talked about the imagination deficit. I think this is where it becomes very interesting, is like, and do we use technology helps us to go faster, quicker, which is of course great, but it's also an opportunity to rethink. You could rethink about, if I use performance management for HR, we can use Gen AI, because we want to sort of use, I don't like to give feedback, I find it difficult, 3 keywords about Leslie, this tone of voice, and it's typically done quite easily. Does it make me better at performance management? Probably not. But if Gen AI could help me identify who are better placed people to give you valuable feedback, that's a very different way to look at it. And sort of, it also could trigger more work, because if I find another 5, 6, 10 people that can give valuable feedback, you potentially make it more complex. I think this is where every new technology has also brought more opportunities, more complexity. And I think many human beings have started to like gadgets a lot and new sort of features and hypes and new apps. Organizationally, we do a bit the same. The more, the better. And I think simplicity is where we need to get back to the essence of, if you look at every one of our organization, we create some complexity. Some complexity is valued by our clients and stakeholders. That's good complexity, but some complexity is self-inflicted. We need to make that distinction, because I don't want to fight complexity. I want to fight the complexity that is not helping us to get to our value, our outcomes that we want to achieve in a consistent, predictable way. And technology is fantastic, but we are at the stage of testing Gen AI. All of us, we don't know how to scale it in most cases. Less than 10% know how to scale. That's where we also have an opportunity. But we get into reskilling. This is typically a challenge for the people, the HR function. Don't know yet what to reskill for. Reskill for Gen AI, that's so vague at this stage. What does that even mean? What's the workforce planning implications of that? So I think we are still at the stage of toying around with what's the business case that we really want to have, what do we want to measure? Because I'm seeing some of these interesting sort of co-pilot and other Gen AI applications where the case is cost saving on personnel cost. Okay, that could be one factor, but if that's the only factor, I'm a bit scared. Yeah,
there's a lot more to consider there. If an HR leader wants to reclaim capacity in their team or organization, what's the practical first step then that they should take?
I'm a bit data-driven, so I would look at getting some insights in terms of what is the actual opportunity to make steps, because I think it is it is the end wave, and depending on how long you've been active professionally, you're looking at all the sort of new technologies, and digital would change everything for everybody. Now it's Gen AI. So I think there are some optimists, so they just want to do it. So if you have these in your organization, just do it and be creative about not doing the same thing faster, better, cheaper, but also think about how do we make it simple? How do we actually sort of get into part of that 15-hour promise? Because you see some good evidence that the 4-hour work week with the same outcomes, the same pay and better quality of life seems to be working. Why aren't we exploring it more? But that's a believer's element. And then you have maybe a bit more of a critical, which is, well, okay, we need the data. And the data is, let's look at it with a couple of teams. How can we improve the Slack team by team? And that's not a perfect approach because we get into limitations because team by team you depend on others and you collaborate, of course. But I think there's already a big step you can do by looking at how can we do it. And we need to think about deducting work because we seem to be great. Most managers are great at adding work, and the stereotype about managers, whatever the size of their team, whatever the budget they have, is they do great work with it by intent. They want to do more of the great work. And then they would say, I need more resources. Well, maybe we should also rethink, like, do we need to keep on doing all of these same things?
Okay, so what can we stop doing?
That's absolutely the most courageous thing to do, yes.
Yeah, not easy, not easy. I want to dive into what actually drives performance in the modern world of work and how HR can lead the way, because despite decades of redesigning, rebranding, reinvention, most performance processes still fall flat when it comes to really unlocking human potential. What's missing?
There's so many different things missing. It has become very complex. It has become something which is a fight everybody wants to fight because there is a strong belief we need to have a performance management approach. It's something that is partially a belief, but it's also, if you would then ask the question like, what's the one thing, if it only does one thing, what's the one thing your performance management thing should do? And I would then offer suggestions like, oh, it helps to bring clarity. It helps to recognize and or reward people. It helps to reward either individuals or also teams. It also helps to develop your leaders. It helps to foster collaboration. It helps to, and then my question, what's the one thing? And then the typical answer I get is all of it. And that's where whatever you have in all sort of things in life, if you want something which is good for many, many different things at the same time, it's so easy to be disappointed because like you want number one mostly, I want number three mostly, or whatever sort of other sequence, and then it's not doing what we expect. It's so easy to be disappointed. We've been setting it up for disappointment because we made it sort of that all-encompassing thing which touches on everything, which is super complex. And at the same time, in most organizations, the simple question, does it actually drive performance? Does it help to sustain performance? We don't really know.
So what's then the key difference between managing performance and enabling human performance?
I think there's a couple of elements in terms of motivational theory, because in managing, you are structuring it. And of course, we can play on the words, but you're structuring a bit more. You are more prone to tell people what they should be doing, which starts from a goal-setting perspective. Like, I expect this of you versus how do we create a context where you can bring value, where you also feel comfortable to speak up to my previous comment about this is not an add value, what is my leeway to do things differently? And if indeed most organizations are still process first, technology second, humans third, it's a bit logical that I'm limited as a human being to adapt that approach. So the enabling performance is how do we create a context where you can bring the best of you in collaboration with others if that's what needed to achieve your objectives, your outcomes. How do we bring it together? So it's a very different way of unpacking and not trying to pile it all on one thing that will fix everything, like motherhood and apple pie, as Americans would tend to say. How do we actually focus on what's the one thing it should do? And maybe we need other activities because the workplace typically helps. The workplace is, if we want to create Slack, what's the environment where you go to recenter? How does that fit into your day if it's a physical place that we all come together in? How do we create all of these moments that create the context for sustained performance? And I think that sustained performance is actually important because you have a lot of facilities these days where offices have the best setup for sprinting. Great, please keep it. But what's the best setup for beyond sprinting and sort of recuperating? And I think that's something where we also need to rethink. And there's just one example of how to embed that in rethinking a context for human performance.
Now, it's actually crazy to expect that a single HR process can drive something as complex as human performance.
It's very tempting. Eh? Like we have one thing that does it all. It's like a Swiss knife. Eh? A Swiss knife is amazing in the format, it fixes everything. But it also sort of, the research this year pointed out that one of the biggest challenges is the trust element. And it's interesting this year to sort of see that typically managers are a bit more positive about organizational processes than employees or workers. This year, it's 61% of managers do not trust their performance management, which is already very high, and 71% of workers do not trust. But trust is so fundamental. We have that one thing that does a lot of things and we don't trust it. If you don't trust your Swiss Army knife, you will probably not take it with you. Your performance measure is typically a bit less optional. And I think that's one of the elements to relook at it. How can we do it? And you see other surveys from competitors looking at it, where sort of even up to only 2% of CHROs would say that their performance management approach is effective.
Yeah, wow. What do you think are the core components of real human performance in today's work environment?
The core components are certainly related to the outcomes that we want to achieve, the value. I think we discussed that. I think that's certainly important. Let's be very clear on that. The room for personal contribution, because I'm not saying everybody should reinvent everything every day, because some things are just efficient with a certain way of doing things. But let's be clear on what's the room that humans have to make a difference, because that's typically where humans have great contribution, also make mistakes. So let's be clear in terms of where we can encourage that. It needs to be sustainable, and that's something where I'm still a bit disappointed by what we don't learn from more professional activities like arts. If you have to have a number of concerts in a row, you don't do that if you're not well prepared, physically, mentally supported. If you are in professional sports, it's the same. We're supposed to be in professional organizations, but to a certain extent, we are not as professional in terms of looking at the body as a whole, the whole person. I think that's important. Let's look at the whole person and how we can enable the whole person to be sustainably performing. And I think there's a team dimension. I think with the complexity of everything we do, is the team dimension is so important in terms of you cannot be successful by yourself in most organizations. And if that's the case, how do we embrace that element? And that brings us to also the link to reward is an important element. And still many leaders have a belief about individual meritocracy. It is something that should recognize the best of the best, and it should make a difference. I think that works to the extent that you can have individual heroes, quote unquote, that are very successful for their organization. Think about that salesperson that made the deal of the year, that made 50% of the sale. In that case, it still applies. But in most organizations, even sales has become so complex that you have so many different stakeholders that there's a team factor. But if you have an underlying belief that individual meritocracy, that's what you want to go after, it also has an impact on your culture, because it goes against certain forms of collaboration. So I think that's also where, let's be very clear, and one of the great examples is, if you want to change the culture of your organization, and if you want to reinvent your industry or sector, and one of the examples we have is in aerospace, I think it's super important to look at what do we do with that? How do we actually enable the possibility to reinvent collaboration, to have the trust restored? So how do we look at restoring trust with performance enablement? Initially, when we discussed it, was a bit shocking for most of us, but it actually makes sense. If we don't have trust, how can we build on enabling human performance and even performance, but human performance for sure? I think that's sort of a very important element to address.
So trust is important. What's the role of purpose, autonomy, psychological safety?
If you would ask academics, many of these concepts touch and overlap to a certain extent. I think purpose, you get a lot of discussions about, is it my individual purpose, is it a collective purpose, is it a company purpose, and what's the role where? I think it needs to be clarity of value outcomes, why we do things, and also the value of how you contribute to it. Psychological safety is a must. I think I mentioned it indirectly, like I didn't use the word fear, but if you don't feel comfortable, that means that you're fearing something. To speak up about our previous trend in terms of work isn't getting in the way of work, And especially when we are looking at that mindset, I need to be 100% productive, whatever my working arrangement is, versus an environment where we say, well, we plan for 80% and 20% we keep open. Maybe not all of it is slack. Maybe some of it is because we want to be flexible as an organization. You get, for example, in a very different dialogue. And you can then still decide with that 20%, and in Belgium, DPG Media is doing that, how we look at using that for organizational flexibility, but also for individual flexibility. They didn't call it slack, but it could have been called slack, bring it together. And I think that's where performance is also becoming more sustainable in the link to that slack notion.
So what is actually required is a mindset shift across the business to treat performance as maybe a shared responsibility, not just for the HR function or not just an HR responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think one of the ways that I tend to look at it is calibration is one of these things that we feel we need to have because we want to be able to compare. And imagine that you are in IT, finance, or HR, just to use these three sort of examples. And then you start calibrating, but the simple question like, in this cycle, whatever cycle is, in this cycle, which of these three functions did an amazing job, a good job, an okay job, not enough? If you don't have that as a starting point, how can you calibrate the rest? But we calibrate from sort of a assumption that performance is sort of a natural given thing and we calibrate it. But if you can't answer the question like saying, HR did in this cycle an amazing job, and IT did a so-so job. Let's assume that would be the case and that we can start from the top having that calibration. If you don't have that, what are you calibrating for? You're creating illusions. So absolutely, we need to make sure that this is a joint responsibility because it should also drive performance. I've been involved in performance management for just over 25 years now. If you would just ask most HR leaders, what do you actually know about the content of goal setting? We don't know. We have some anecdotal evidence. And that's also where GenAI is on a journey to help us in terms of what's the quality of goal setting. We typically look at the process, following up the process, consistency, compliance in terms of we doing it. But how good, how actionable, how motivational are these goals? And then the second element, the research is quite strict about the frequency of goal revisiting is also having a high likeliness to high performance organization. A monthly cycle of revisiting goals is the most likely to have a high performance environment, which is also a psychological human element related to what you said is like, if I don't have fear, if I have clarity of what's coming, if I have the trust of working together and we have cycles which you can look at because these days even more than ever, can we anticipate what we will do the next 12 months? There's so many scenarios going on. So how do we bring that? And that's a joint role. But we should also look at performance because so far it is very much the compliance of the process and the outcomes of the process. The actual underlying performance is a bit fake, if we are being frank.
Now suppose, last question, I'm an HR leader, rethinking performance today. What is the first step that I should take that goes beyond retooling the process?
The first step that I would suggest is, what if we don't have performance management? And looking at it from what I think you called out, that sort of bigger monster of different things. You didn't use say monster, but that bigger thing, bigger thing of all these things coming together. And then, so let's try to get sort of what would happen if we turn it off, even just for reasoning purposes, turning it off, because we need to break it up. Like and performance management has been used in many organizations with the hope that they would improve the average quality of people leaders. Most HR leaders tell me, well, we wish we have great people leaders, but we wish on average that we had better people leaders. Most of the performance management process was supposed to contribute to that. Most cases we don't know, and I would suspect we don't know is because that didn't impact it much. So getting back to what's the one thing it should do, but also what's the one thing it should do, maybe not for a general population, but to make it specific. One of the examples that I find very inspiring is a Belgium-based organization. I cannot name them yet, but they broke it up. They broke it up about, yes, we believe that there are a group of people that are outstanding performance that should be recognized, that should go through the structure and the heaviness potentially of having strict goal setting, calibration up front, potentially better reward consequences for a small group of people. But they also went, well, we have a big group of people that are experts. We value their contribution. We don't want them to start doing quote-unquote crazy things. We want that consistency of what they bring. So they're going in a way where for 70, and they will move up to 80% of people up front, they tell them, your performance will be a solid performance. Let's not bother each other with all sorts of tools and applications. We need to have regular conversations because we want to sort of work well together. But let's get part of that annoying part, like what will be the consequence, what will be my grade, they get it out of the way. And then they have, unfortunately, some people that might not be performing up to standard, where they also want to have a very close follow-up, hopefully to get these people completely back on track, if that's possible. And if not, let's not bother their entire organization to start compiling information about why a certain person is maybe not performing up to standard, how can we document that. You don't need to bother 90% of the people or more, if it's potentially only a small group. So I like that sort of more diversified approach. But the one first thing is, if it would only do one thing, what is it? And as long as you don't have that aligned messaging within your leadership team, I don't think you're ready to redesign it and re-engineer it.
Really clear. Really interesting conversation, Yves. Thank you very much. Well, that's it for today's episode in our special series on Deloitte's 2025 Human Capital Trends. If this conversation inspired you, if it challenged you, your thinking, or if it gave you new ideas, well, then share it with your colleagues, with your team, and with your network. Let's spread the insights and spark even more meaningful conversations in the world of work. Thank you very much for tuning in and for listening. And remember, it's a great time to be in HR.